Thank you all for being here. So today I'm presenting my PhD proposal on Analytics for X, a general purpose framework for analysis and optimization of HPC data movement. So before I really get into it, I want to start by acknowledging various people I've worked with. So of course, I want to recognize my advisor, Taufer, and all my committee members, Schuman, Jae-Seung, Olga, Pearce, and Michael Jantz. I also want to recognize all my collaborators, particularly from Lawrence Livermore, but also various collaborators from University of Utah and KTH. And I want to recognize all the current and former members of the Global Computing Lab for making my experience through my PhD such a good one. I also want to briefly go over the various research artifacts that have been born from my PhD work. So conference publications, workshop publications, posters, tutorials, and the various pieces of software I have worked on. With all that said, I'm now going to get into the actual talk. So I want to start by talking about data movement and its increasing importance in today's applications. So as we've gone to newer and newer systems, we have increasingly experienced a widening gap in I/O performance. Our compute performance has exploded, and although I/O performance has gotten better, it's gotten better at a much slower rate, causing I/O and data movement to be an increasingly large bottleneck in today's applications. And this has only been exacerbated by our transition from our conventional bulk synchronous simulations like standalone molecular dynamics to task-based applications like distributed deep learning training and molecular multi-scale simulation workflows. And so as this gap's gotten wider and wider, and as we've had this exacerbating factor of applications getting more complex, the importance of understanding and by extension optimizing data movement has become increasingly important. And so to that end, we claim that scientists need a general purpose adaptable analytic framework to understand data movement and by extension optimize it in increasingly complex and diverse workload-based applications. Now, we're not just going to go into building that framework blindly. Instead, we start by performing three other contributions shown here. And from each of these contributions, we derive an overarching lesson learned and a corresponding feature for our analytic framework, which we call Analytics for X. Before I dive into the first contribution, I want to start by talking about A4X at a high level, and then as I walk through the talk, I'm going to show how these features we develop plug into the figure on the right. So A4X consists of three main parts. The first is A4X core, which can conceptually be thought of as abstraction, two parts, abstraction over data movement solutions and integration of performance annotations to enable fair performance comparisons across tools like Lustre, Diet, and MPI. The second part of A4X is A4X orchestration, which is an abstraction over the configuration of different orchestration tools and resource managers. And then finally, we have A4X benchmark, which is a benchmark that enables the studying of data movement performance in workflow applications through a controlled and highly configurable environment that is created by integrating both orchestration and core. So with all that said, let's get into the first contribution, which is identifying bottlenecks in applications like AMD 2013 by designing a call path query language for performance profiles. I want to start with, well, what performance data is. On the left, you can see a representation of performance data, which, when it comes to profiles, oftentimes represented as a call graph. The vertices in this graph represent regions, oftentimes function calls. The edges in the graph represent caller-callee relationships, so main calls func A calls func D, etc. And then for each vertex, you have a set of associated metrics. For example, you'll have the name, the time spent in that function, and other things like, for example, L2 cache misses. With this data and existing tools, we can get results like what's shown on the right here, which depicts the time spent in MPI for the AMD 2013 proxy app for both Mbappage and Spectrum MPI. There's two main notable things that we can observe from this. First off, Spectrum MPI is about 3 times slower than Mbappage in this application, and most of the time in both MPI libraries is spent in AllGather. So from that, we could conclude that Spectrum's worse time is likely caused by AllGather, but we can't really conclude anything more. And that's because existing profiling tools ignore the call graph in filtering operations, which prevents scientists from actually diving deeper into the performance bottlenecks like this one here. We can see that AllGather is the problem, but we can't see why it's the problem. That is repeated on the left side of this slide. So tools like these four, again, don't use the call graph in filtering operations, but if we want to use the call graph, we can draw inspiration from graph database tools, which allow you to filter and query the structure and data of graphs. But due to deployment and various other complicating factors, these tools tend not to be used in HPC performance analysis. So in our work, we do a bit of transfer or knowledge transfer, and we take premise concepts from graph databases and apply them to performance data through what we call our call path query language. From a high level, the way that this works is as inputs, you pass in your call graph, which is essentially your performance data, and your query, which describes what you want to get out. And then our query language spits out a filtered version of the call graph depicting data that you asked for. This tool is already integrated into Lawrence Livermore's Thicket tool, so you can use this today. But to understand how it works and why you might want to use it, I want to talk some about what queries actually are and how they're composed. And I want to talk about the algorithm to apply these queries to data. To start with composition, our queries in general are abstract descriptions of paths in a graph. You can think of it as a regex for paths. To that sense, a path in a graph is a sequence of vertices. Our query is similarly a sequence of query nodes, as shown on the right. Each query node is then a tuple of a quantifier and a predicate. A quantifier essentially tells you how many nodes in your call graph to match to the query node. And the predicate tells you how to do that matching, essentially what conditions have to be satisfied in terms of the metrics of that vertex to actually match the query node. To show this a bit more concretely, let's look at the following example. On the left, you have two equivalent plain English descriptions of a query. So in this case, find all subgraphs rooted at an MPI node with more than 5 L2 cache misses. On the right, you have the corresponding query in what we call our base syntax. So the query class here represents the query itself. Match represents the first query node, successive calls to rel, add query nodes to the end. The strings dot and star as the first arguments of both match and rel are our quantifiers, and these are derived straight from regex. So dot means match 1, star means match 0 or more. And then the big lambda in the middle is your predicate. It's a Python callable that takes in the metrics as input and returns a Boolean as output. Now that's a lot. So to that end, we also define what we call dialects to this query language to simplify things. So on the left, you have the same query as on the last slide, and then in the middle and right, you have the same query rewritten with 2 of our dialects. There are various pros and cons to these. I'm not going to get into them too much at this point, but by having these dialects, we provide a kind of trade-off system for users. Now, knowing how to build the queries is one thing, but we also have to apply those queries to the data. And the way we do that starts by recognizing that the challenge of applying queries to data is a variant of the subgraph isomorphism problem. So to that end, we apply Ullmann's algorithm, one of the classic algorithms for subgraph isomorphism, to this problem. But we make a few tiny tweaks. So we first use our predicates instead of the degree-based node comparison from the original algorithm, and we add support for our quantifiers. Now that I've explained kind of what queries are and how we apply them to data, I want to talk about how we can actually use this by giving an example. To start, though, I want to mention how we actually got the results you're going to see on the next few slides. So we did all of our runs on LLNL's Lassen system. We use HPC Toolkit to actually collect our performance data. And then we use Thicket for performance analysis. Thicket was used without our query language to represent getting results with existing tools, and with our query language to represent what our query language can do. So in this example, we look at the 82013 application, which if you're not familiar, is a proxy app representative of the computations in computational fluid dynamics. We compare and backfetch spectrum MPI across various MPI ranks. We collect 2 main types of metrics. The first is the time spent in MPI, and the second is the percent of that time spent in different functions. The time, I should mention, is shown by the data labels on the tops of these bars, and the percent time is shown by the bars themselves. With that said, without our query language, again, we can get the following 2 observations. Spectrum MPI is 3 times slower, and most of that time is spent in all-gather. But again, the problem here, we can't figure out why spectrum is really that much slower outside of just saying it's all-gather. So to figure that out, we apply our query language, in particular the query shown in the string dialect in the middle here, to zoom into and focus on the internals of MPI all-gather, and the results are shown on the right. Notably, Spectrum MPI uses pthread spinlock for a larger percentage of its time than backfetch, which implies that Spectrum MPI's use of pthread spinlock is the likely cause of MPI all-gather's worst performance in Spectrum MPI. And we can derive similar performance insights from other tools. So to that end, from this general contribution I just presented, we derive a big overarching lesson learned, which is that call path-based filtering of performance data enables more detailed analysis of data movement layers than previously was possible. And so to that end in A4X, we want to be able to support fine-grained I/O layering within performance profiles. To do that, I want to refresh your memory by showing this figure again. This is essentially A4X as we have explained it so far. And we integrate this feature, particularly here, into A4X4's abstractions, which we designed to integrate easily with our query language by creating a consistent and unified profile structure across data movement solutions, which enables simple I/O layer filtering. So now moving on to the second contribution, we study data movement performance in MD, molecular dynamics, or MD, workflows by comparing several data movement solutions with our query language. To start, I want to talk some about the actual challenge of data movement in multi-scale simulation workflows, using the MUMI workflow here as an example. So MUMI here is a workflow from Lawrence Livermore National Lab that aims to study changes in shape and mutations essentially to the RAS protein near the human cell membrane, which is important because mutations to this protein occur in a large percentage of all the different types of human cancers that we observe today. As you can see just from the science figure here, this is a very complex workflow, and that complexity is only enhanced when we look at it from a more computer science focus. In this figure at the bottom, you can see three different types of data movement. The green arrows going down in coarse-grained model and all-atom model represent one-to-one data movement. The blue arrows running from left to right throughout the figure represent one-to-many data movement, and the orange figures going the other way, right to left, represent many-to-one data movement. With all this different data movement going on, data movement is pretty clearly an important part of this workflow, and understanding its data movement is similarly important. Now, trying to tackle all of this at once is extremely difficult, so instead, in this chapter, we focus on an empirical study to understand the data movement of a one-to-one MD workflow, representative of the coarse-grained all-atom model one-to-one communications from the previous slide. In this workflow, we have a producer and consumer attached to essentially MD simulation or something indicative of it on the left, and MD analysis, on-the-fly MD analysis, I should say, on the right. Connecting them, we consider three different tools: XFS, Luster, and Dyad. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to gloss over the single node stuff with XFS and Dyad, and we're going to focus instead on multi-node Luster and multi-node Dyad. So Luster, if you're not familiar, is the predominant parallel file system in HPC applications. And the way it works at a very high level is essentially your producer, which is MD here, is going to write data through the Luster client to the remote Luster file system, and then reading the data back to in the consumer, which is analysis, is just the opposite. Read data out of the remote file system through the client to the application. Our other tool we're looking at here is Dyad, which is a middleware from Lawrence Livermore National Lab for accelerating write once, read many styles of I/O workloads. I'm going to be very high level with this, but simply put, the consumer is going to write data through the client. That data goes to an SSD on the producer's node. Metadata is going to be written into a Dyad metadata store, which the Dyad client on the consumer side can then wait for. This provides a synchronization of the producer and consumer. Once the client knows data is available, it'll request that data from the Dyad service, write it to its local SSD, and then from there, the analysis is just going to read data off of the SSD. That's a lot. So the main thing I want to highlight, I really want to focus on here, though, is the metadata store. Unlike Luster and XFS, Dyad provides a built-in implicit synchronization of producers and consumers. This is really important to make sure the consumer doesn't try and read data before it's available. And other tools like XFS and Luster do not provide any of this synchronization. So most scientists fall back to the approach of only running the consumer after the producer is finished, which we reflect in our empirical study. The last detail of this study before we start getting into results is the actual simulation scale. We don't just blindly do like sleeps here. We focus our timings and data sizes on actual molecules. So we consider a range of molecules ranging from Jack, which is a medium molecule, all the way to STMV, which is a really large molecule that actually requires a supercomputer to accurately simulate. For each of these molecules, we have different numbers of atoms and corresponding frame sizes, where the frame size here represents the amount of data moving between producer and consumer. With all that said, before I move into results, I want to talk about the system and performance tools again. So first, we have our Corona system from Lawrence Livermore, which is what we run on. We collect all our performance data with Caliper and analyze it with Thicket. And notably, we use our query language from chapter 1 to filter the performance profiles and capture I/O performance. Now, in the full version of this work, we consider all 5 of these questions. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus specifically on this one, though. How does performance change as we increase our molecular model size, which is a proxy for data size? So to do that, we take our one-to-one workflow, and we're comparing luster and diet across multiple nodes. Our molecular model size, represented by Jack through STMB, is our scaling mechanism. And we measure 2 metrics. First is data movement time, shown in red, which is the time spent actively moving data, say from a hard drive or SSD or over the network. And then we have idle time, shown in blue, which is the time spent in operations that synchronize the producer and consumer. I also want to highlight briefly on the left that we have these data labels at the tops of some of the bars. In some cases, the idle time was so large that we couldn't reasonably put it on the same figure without making the rest of it unreadable. So in those cases, the total idle time is shown by those data labels. So looking at the results at a high level, we see the figure on the left. As you can see by looking at the data movement time in red, both luster and diet take up more and more time to go to larger and larger molecules. But despite that, diet always outperforms luster in data movement. In idle time, you see an even more drastic difference. Regardless of scale, diet is substantially faster in idle time than luster. And this goes back to that built-in synchronization of producers and consumers that I mentioned previously. Now, this is interesting, but it's more useful to look more in detail. And so to that end, we focus on Jack and STMB, our smallest and largest molecules, and we use our query language to zoom into the specific regions of performance associated with those 2 tools. This shows the overall look, but we can further use the query language to zoom in even further to data movement and idle times. So focusing first on data movement, we can see broadly that, both tools increase in time. But now we can also look at these specific mechanisms by relating the code regions to actual code behavior. So looking at luster first, we see just read single buff increases. That's the POSIX read function effectively. It's just reading data off of the disk or off of a storage solution. In diet, it's more complex. You do see an increase in its read single buff, which is again just POSIX read. But you also have these other 2. For diet, get data is the time spent reading data from the producer node, so transferring data from the producer node to the memory of the consumer node. And then diet const store is time spent saving that data into the consumer's SSD. Additionally, when we look at idle times, we can again zoom in with our query language and focus on specific regions. Here with luster, explicit sync is just the time waiting for the producer to finish effectively, like I mentioned earlier, whereas diet fetch is actually querying and waiting on metadata to be available in diet's global metadata management solution. One thing that's perhaps interesting to note is that diet's idle time actually goes down as we go through scales. This is because as we get to larger and larger molecules, there's more, the balance of pressure shifts from being mostly metadata pressure to mostly data pressure. And so the metadata service is less bottlenecked and can run faster. From all this, we can derive an overall finding, which is that leveraging local resources and efficient communication protocols enables better scalability as data sizes increase. We have similar findings and stuff for all of our other questions, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to mention those. But what I am going to mention is our overarching lesson learned from this contribution, which is that middleware can substantially improve data movement efficiency for workflows by aligning I/O with workflow execution patterns. And from that, we say that we need a built-in capability to integrate middleware level performance data, like the data that allowed us to reach our findings in this chapter, into workflow optimization. To do that, we again go back to our view of A4X as of now. We integrate this feature into A4X Core, which integrates this middleware level performance data through built-in annotations that capture metrics and characteristics needed to fairly compare different data movement solutions like luster, diet, and MPI. So I'm now going to move on to the final contribution that has already been completed, which is assessing deriving storage system's ability to mitigate I/O bottlenecks in the IPIC3D application through phase-aware I/O characterization and IOR benchmarking. This entire chapter centers on an application called IPIC3D, the science case for which is shown on the left. When running on El Capitan, IPIC3D was able to achieve full resolution simulation of the magnetic field of a small to medium planetoid like Mercury and solar plasma. That's what the figure on the left is showing. And it was able to do that at full resolution, full kinetic simulation, no simplifying assumptions, stuff like that. And that's a really cool and good scientific result. But there is a trade-off, and that is the I/O bottleneck shown on the right. iPic3D spends about a third of its time in I/O, split between the three I/O phases shown here. There's restart data, which has to do with writing checkpoints. There's field data, where we write data like magnetic fields. And there's moment data, where we write information like density. To mitigate this problem, in this chapter, we look at something called the Rabbit storage system, which is available on the El Capitan family of supercomputers. Notably, Rabbits are the special nodes containing SSDs and EPIC CPUs that sit close to the compute nodes and are connected to compute nodes in two ways. There are first the PCIe connections linking the compute nodes in Rabbit together, and they're also connected through the broader slingshot interconnect, represented here by the NICs. With this very complex hardware setup, Rabbits are able to provide a very dynamic storage environment for applications. Notably, users can configure Rabbits to represent node local storage through XFS. Rabbits can also provide job global luster storage that's shared across all the nodes. Or, most interestingly for this work, it can also do both simultaneously, a hybrid approach for providing both local storage and luster storage. So in this work, in this chapter, I should say, we aim to assess the ability of the Rabbit storage system to mitigate the I/O bottleneck of iPic3D shown on the left. To do that, we introduce a three-phase mapping methodology to actually optimize this. In step one, we run and analyze iPic3D's I/O to identify its dominant phases and quantify and characterize the performance of those phases. In step two, we take the characterization of each I/O phase and turn it into a configuration of the IOR benchmark, which we use to identify optimal storage configurations for each phase. And in step three, we take each of those optimal storage configurations and we integrate it back into the actual application and compare the optimized application performance to the original at the very top of this figure. Before I get into the results for this chapter, I want to briefly mention that all the results were run on the LLNL's Tuolumne system, and we used a combination of LLNL's Caliper, DF Tracer, and DF Analyzer tools for performance monitoring and analysis. So on this slide, I have a very abbreviated set of results here. So in step one, again, we looked at our phases. So we have restart data, file for process, takes a lot of time, large transfer sizes. Then we have field and moment data, which are collective, small time, small data, but it has really bad bandwidth for the system-wide luster, which implies that it's a good target for further optimization. In step two, we can take essentially each column of this table, turn it into configurations of IOR, and then run on different storage systems. The results for restart data are shown here, and as you can see, Rabbit XFS here is clearly the best choice for restart data, as it has the best bandwidth overall, and it actually scales as we increase our number of nodes, which luster does not really. And then we take those optimal configurations, integrate them back to the application, and the results for that are shown here. In the bottom figure here, blue represents our original version of iPic, that's writing everything out system-wide luster, and red represents our optimized version, where we redirect each phase to different types of Rabbit storage. The big thing to note here is that our Rabbit optimized configuration of iPic3D achieves up to a 4.85 times improvement in I/O throughput and 1.45 times overall application speedup. Additionally, our methodology shows the benefits of Rabbits in mitigating I/O bottlenecks, and it shows how taking a phase-aware and benchmark-driven approach to optimizing I/O is increasingly important in today's applications, which is effectively our lesson learned for this chapter. The main lesson learned is that matching I/O phases to target storage systems can yield substantial performance gains, like what we showed, but it does require phase-aware monitoring and tuning. And so for A4X, we want to provide automated phase detection and benchmark-driven mapping to optimal storage configurations, which we integrate into the benchmark, which enables this benchmark-driven mapping by providing a controlled configurable environment that leverages the other components of A4X. With all that said, this slide here kind of serves as a summary of everything I've talked about so far. Already for my dissertation, we have completed the 3 different contributions, deriving lessons learned and features for our Analytics for X framework. For the rest of the talk, I want to talk about essentially what we are proposing as remaining work and the timeline for that. The main piece of remaining work that's left is actually assessing and leveraging A4X, which we want to do by going back to the workflow from chapter 2. To actually leverage and assess A4X, we want to essentially use a methodology similar to the one from chapter 3, with the workflow, to optimize the workflow from chapter 2, while leveraging the query language from chapter 1. To do that, we're also going to consider two different sets of tools, kind of two axes for optimization. The first are data movement tools, namely Lustre, Dyad, and MPI. And the right are orchestration and resource management tools, namely the MPI orchestrator built into A4X benchmark, Pegasus, and Flux. When we look at data movement tools, we're going to consider the following hierarchy of times and various derived metrics like throughput. But we're particularly going to focus on these bottom three here, so data movement time, idle time, and kind of the sum of those two, which is data sharing time. Similarly, when we're considering orchestration and resource management tools, we're going to consider the same metrics. We're going to focus on the top three: make span, compute time, and data sharing time. And by comparing these, we want to assess the overhead of different orchestrators like Pegasus and Flux. I want to end off on this slide talking about the research plan for the remaining work. So the three contributions I presented in this talk are already complete. The last proposed piece of work is actually A4X itself. And to that end, we have already designed A4X and implemented it. I'm in the process of finishing kind of unit testing and making sure the thing actually works, which I'm almost done with. And then the last two steps are conducting a case study, case study that I described in the previous slides, and then gathering all this up and summarizing it through a paper in a publication. So I want to thank you all for attending and listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.